Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind the documents. We are Sara and Mark. Today, we are going to dive into the material we have on the table. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember to check the description for the links to access the original material. That's right, and for context, our analysis in this explainer is based squarely on the book Milei, the Reform Blueprint, 18 Principles for Leaders and Citizens Who Demand Results, by Max Basil, which you can actually grab on Amazon using the link down in the description. Today, we're zeroing in exclusively on Chapter 2, and it explores a really provocative concept, the absolute necessity of cutting the state before raising taxes. You know, it's this massive global paradox. Why do governments, when they're staring down a huge deficit, predictably choose to just hike taxes on everyday citizens instead of trimming their own bloated budgets first? We're going to dive right into the mechanics of that.
So Max Basil's central thesis in Chapter 2 is pretty uncompromising. He states that substantial reductions in state spending simply must precede any tax increases. And what's really fascinating here is the structural trap he highlights. Basically, the argument is that when a government tries to raise taxes on an economy that's already strained just to close a budget gap, it actually severely distorts economic incentives and absolutely kills growth.
Right, exactly. It becomes this completely self-defeating cycle. Think about it. If you tax an already struggling productive sector without fundamentally fixing how much the government is spending, you just end up shrinking your own tax base. Businesses and everyday people are essentially pushed into the informal economy, the black market, literally just to survive. And the result? The state collects even less revenue, but those massive spending obligations are still there. So the structural imbalance actually gets so much worse.
Which brings us to what the text brilliantly calls the tax-first distortion. This is a universal structural problem. Politicians everywhere face this deeply ingrained incentive to choose that tax-first approach. And why? Well, because raising taxes spreads the pain out across millions of people. It's a diffuse kind of pain. But cutting spending? That means firing actual bureaucrats, cutting specific subsidies, and facing the immediate wrath of highly organized, really vocal interest groups. Hit the nail on the head. The tax-first approach is basically the path of least political resistance. But the problem is it leaves the whole inefficient state structure completely intact. Any new revenue just ends up funding further spending. On the flip side, the cut-first approach is politically brutal, but it's economically necessary. It signals actual fiscal prudence, it restores credibility with the markets, and it attacks the root cause of inflation by strictly controlling outlays.
Okay, so let's move from the theory to a real-world application. Section 2. The 2024 Argentina Case, specifically slashing discretionary transfers.
Yeah, we're going to look closely at how Javier Milei's administration actually targeted the state apparatus itself to enforce discipline before asking taxpayers for another dime.
So in 2024, the administration basically decided to flip the traditional script entirely. They absolutely needed to enforce fiscal discipline, but rather than immediately going after the taxpayers, they targeted specific subnational funds to enforce discipline from within. So what exactly are these discretionary transfers? Well, the text defines them really clearly. They are flexible federal funds given to provinces. Historically, they were supposed to be for regional development, but the book points out that they evolved into these massive, politically driven subsidies. They became completely detached from any sort of accountability or real performance metrics.
It's such a fascinating dynamic. The central government was essentially bankrolling provincial deficits, which obviously fostered this incredibly deep dependency. Provincial governors literally didn't need to balance their own budgets or make any tough local choices. They could just absorb these flexible funds. And how did the central government finance all this? By printing money, which, of course, fueled massive inflation. It was essentially an accounting trick masking a massive structural deficit.
So how do you even begin to dismantle a system like that? The mechanical execution laid out in the text is essentially a three-step process. First, you dramatically shrink those discretionary transfer envelopes. You basically just turn off the tap.
Right. And step 2 is the immediate unavoidable consequence of that. You force the provinces to reassess their own priorities. Because those automatic central bailouts are no longer a sure thing, the provinces finally have to internalize their own commercial risk. And then finally, step 3, both the federal and provincial governments are forced to actually cut non-essential state functions and bureaucratic excess simply because that artificial funding is totally gone.
But actually executing this sequence brings up a massive structural hurdle. Let's look at the federalism complication, central discipline versus provincial autonomy.
Oh, for sure. It's the classic ongoing battle in any decentralized system.
Right, because in a federalist system like Argentina or even the US, you have fundamentally opposing goals between these overlapping jurisdictions. The national government's primary mandate is macroeconomic stability.
They desperately need to lower inflation and balance the national budget just to survive on the global stage. But then you look at the provincial governments, and they have a completely different objective. They want to retain transfer funds and avoid any local austerity. Since provinces rely so heavily on central funds, mostly because their own tax bases are either limited or just way too politically sensitive to tap into, they have absolutely zero incentive to consolidate their own local budgets. So when the national government cuts those transfers, it shifts the accountability directly onto those local leaders, which causes immense political friction.
And this brings us right into the intense political trade-offs of the cut-first approach. Like we noted earlier, taxes cause diffuse pain, but spending cuts trigger really concentrated resistance. You almost immediately face massive backlash from public sector unions the second their jobs or budgets are slashed.
Exactly. And you also get fierce resistance from those provincial governors who all of a sudden have to be the bad guys to their own constituents. You risk real service disruptions and acute short-term social strain. But the book makes it very clear that choosing expenditure restraint over taxation is a highly deliberate choice. It's choosing to absorb short-term, highly concentrated political damage in order to protect the long-term economic vitality of the whole country.
The year 2024 really stands as the crucible for this whole experiment. The text points out that weathering this kind of storm requires just sheer political courage. It's a total endurance test against immediate protests, strikes, and heavy political mobilization.
It really is. The reformers have to calculate that the long-term gains, restoring the economy, stopping inflation, bringing back investment, will eventually outweigh the immediate anger. If they blink or if they just decide to raise taxes to quiet the protests, the whole structural reform basically collapses, and that deficit trap snaps right shut again.
Which brings us to a crucial part of the puzzle, Section 3, Citizen Accountability, and how we actually measure real fiscal reform.
Right. It's all about how we, the public, can measure if real fiscal reform is happening and cut through all the political rhetoric.
Because, let's face it, politicians are notoriously great at announcing cuts while quietly shifting the spending somewhere else. But the ultimate citizen metric highlighted in the text is the spending to GDP ratio. It is a very basic but incredibly powerful gauge. It essentially shows the total weight of the government relative to the size of the entire economy.
Exactly. If a government claims they are cutting the state before taxing, this specific ratio simply must consistently decline over time. If the spending to GDP ratio stays flat, or worse, goes up, you know for a fact they are just replacing one form of inefficiency with another, or funding the state through sneaky backdoor taxes.
We also really need to look at the subnational level, because that's where so much of the spending actually hides. To hold local leaders accountable, citizens have to track the scale and the volatility of federal transfers compared to actual local revenue.
Yeah, exactly, Sarah. Because if a province's budget is still heavily dominated by discretionary central transfers, then real accountability hasn't actually taken root at all. But if you see the share of local revenue naturally increasing while discretionary transfers shrink, it proves that the underlying structural distortion is actually being corrected rather than it just being superficial compliance to appease the national government.
So, the key takeaway from this chapter is that the sequence really truly matters. You simply cannot build a durable foundation for growth by taxing a fundamentally broken system. Sustained spending discipline is literally the only thing that actually interrupts these destructive fiscal cycles. It's all about realigning those incentives. Cutting the state before raising taxes forces the government to actually live within reality. It signals true credibility to the market, and it protects the productive sectors of the economy from just being squeezed out into the black market. It's definitely painful and it's politically dangerous, but according to this blueprint, it is absolutely essential.
Which leaves us with a highly provocative question to think about. Will this fragile advance against fiscal imbalance endure the ultimate test of political pressure, or will the historical gravity of the deficit trap just pull it right back in?
It's a question that is quite literally being answered in real time. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember to check the video description. See you in the next analysis.